Well, thank you, Bob. I appreciate it, and I did this last year, and we talked about something different. It's always, a pleasure to be here. Ever since I can remember, music has been a constant presence in my life. I was, as you can probably tell, not born in Tennessee, but I was born in Europe, in the country of Spain, and I teach Spanish at UT Martin. But in my free time, I do a lot that has to do with music. I love listening to music. I love reading about it, learning about it. I don't play an instrument myself, but I love to listen to people playing music and learning a lot about its history. And today, since Bob told me that you were talking quite a bit about radio and records and the popularization of music, country music, blues music, jazz, popular music in general. That's what I'm going to be talking about quite a bit. I began listening to music through the Beatles. My father is a huge collector of records and books, and he has probably about 12, 15,000 records at home, and so music was always around. And I began listening to the Beatles, and then I started going back through the Beatles, learning more about the rhythm and blues, the rockabilly, the early rock and roll from the 50s, the country music, and so I began to learn more and more about American music and its different forms. And right now, what I'm most interested in is jazz. Jazz I find is the most interesting kind of music that the U.S. produced in the 20th century. Very, lasting music with lasting impact all over the world. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about jazz today, but what I want to really do is talk about radio, records, and the popularization of music, popular music. So it could be country music, it could be blues, it could be jazz. And you have to think, when you think about something like this, that from 1927 on, 1927 was the year that a movie called The Jazz Singer came out. It wasn't really a movie about jazz. There wasn't much jazz in the movie. There was a singer. His name was Al Jolson, probably one of the biggest entertainers at the time. But the movie was important, not just because of music, but also because it was the first talking picture that came out. And it wasn't really a talking picture. Before that, we had silent movies. There was no sound in them. And this was not a fully talking picture. It was a silent movie that had a little dialogue here and there, a little music here and there. But that was a big break from 1927. So from 1927 on, the movies became a medium to popularize music. But before that, it was mostly records and also the new medium of radio, which became widespread in the 20s and 30s. Records had existed since the late 19th century. And you can listen to some of those cylinders and old discs, and they don't sound very well, but that was how people began reproducing sound for the first time, and they could see that it could be used to record music. And in the 20s and 30s, radio becomes very important when it comes to the spreading and the popularization of music. I don't know, do you usually listen to the radio much these days? Occasionally. Maybe you listen to podcasts. That's another way of radio that we have in the 21st century. Well, if you had been alive 80 or 90 years ago, and I wasn't, but you would be listening to the radio quite a bit, both in urban areas and in rural areas, because radio was like a window to the rest of the country and to the rest of the world as well. There was no television, there was no internet, and of course, the radio was the window that people had in places like Jackson or Memphis or Nashville or all over the South and all over the country. But before radio, records were the way in which music was spread. It was through sheet music, so you could buy the actual sheet music and play it yourself, but that meant that you had to learn to play for example, the piano or the ukulele or the guitar or something like that. And records. People bought records, people listened to records, and different types of music were commercialized before the 1920s. Classical music, whatever was popular in vaudeville, the music of tenors, Irish songs, Victorian ballads, sacred songs, but almost no blues, almost no country music, almost no jazz until the 1920s. And that starts changing in the 1920s because country music, which was known by then as hillbilly music, that's what they used to say, blues and to a certain extent jazz began to be recorded in the 1920s because the company saw that there was a market for this. And so, for example, the records in the early 20s by blues singers like Mamie Smith or Ma Rainey or Trixie Smith, Bessie Smith, the country records of Fiddling John Carson, of Eck Robertson and Henry Gilliland, well, the company saw that these records, they didn't know this, but they realized that these records sold. And so they started turning to blues musicians, they started turning to country musicians to record. They saw this market, and so rather than inviting the rural musicians to come to the north, to New York, for example, to record, which was a recording center in the U.S., as it still is, instead of doing this, what they started doing was sending producers on field trips to the South to record blues musicians, to record country musicians. For example, in 1927, you may have talked about this, in Bristol, here in Tennessee. Bristol is a town in East Tennessee. Part of the town is in Tennessee, part of the town is in Virginia. This happens sometimes, right? Like in Fulton and South Fulton, where South Fulton is in Tennessee and Fulton is in Kentucky. Well, same thing over there. And so they sent this producer called Ralph Peer, very important man, and he set up shop for a few days in Bristol, Virginia, or Bristol, Tennessee. I don't know what part of the city he was recording in, but he started recording country musicians from the area, wanting to make commercial recordings to sell. And these groundbreaking sessions usually are known as the Big Bang of country music. They're not the first sessions in country music history. There were sessions before, but these were important because of the bulk of the material that was recorded. And they mark the beginning of the recording careers of two very influential acts that you may have heard of. First of all, there's Jimmie Rodgers, the singing brakeman, and then there's also the Carter family. They started their careers in Bristol, Tennessee, or Virginia with Ralph Peer in 1927. And they became hugely influential, very popular, not just within white country musicians, but also with black blues musicians. Because at those times, the lines between genres were kind of blurred. They were not as clear cut as they became later. And different musicians were listening to different kinds of music. The Bristol sessions are very well known for this, but they were not the only ones. For example, later on, I think in 1928, in Johnson City, also in Tennessee, there were other sessions similar because those records began to sell. And so the companies were thinking, hey, we've been neglecting all of this rural market, both, black and white, and we can't keep doing this because there's money to be made. So they kept recording different musicians in country music, blues, and also jazz. And Ralph Peer, I'm sure you may have heard the name in the class, he was a very interesting character, not just because of the Bristol sessions, but also because he was among the first to record classic blues singers like Mamie Smith in the early 20s. And then, incredibly enough, he was responsible for some of Louis Armstrong's Hot Fives and Hot Seven recordings. Those were small group jazz recordings that some of which Ralph Peer produced. So he was there not just at the beginning of country music. He's usually recognized for that, but he was also there when he was recording other styles of music, classic blues and hot jazz. There was nothing hotter in jazz than Louis Armstrong in the late 20s. He changed the face of jazz music with those Hot 5 and Hot 7 recordings. So if you're interested, for example, in the figure of Ralph Peer, there are two interesting books written by a music critic called Barry Mazor, M-A-Z-O-R. This is a man that I got a chance, he's based out of Nashville. I got a chance to interview on a podcast that I do several months ago. And one of his books is called Ralph Peer and the Making of Popular Roots Music. You know, that's a very good approach to Peer's career. And then there's a book that he wrote about Jimmie Rodgers, the blue yodeler who mixed, you know, yodel with blues with country and became one of the hottest acts in the early years of country music. And that book is called Meeting Jimmie Rodgers. Those are very two interesting books. If you're interested in seeing a recreation of how those sessions, blues sessions in this case, were recorded and produced, there's a film that used to be on Netflix, I don't know if it is anymore, called Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. Black Bottom was a kind of dance that was kind of jazzy at the time, and Ma Rainey was well known for her blues recordings. It's a very good movie that you might be interested in. So there was a huge recording boom in the mid to late 20s because the companies started discovering these rural markets that they didn't know existed before, and so a lot of jazz, blues, country, folk music, even Cajun music from this period, even Jewish music was preserved on records. And you know, I want you to think, for example, about the importance of records. You know, if we didn't have those records, we would not be able to study music the way that we do. We would have to rely on sheet music, but you wouldn't be able to hear the music the way it was played. And that's good about records. But what's a problem with records is that when we study music based on records and radio broadcasts, this is a partial view of the music, because not everybody got to record. Not all kinds of music were recorded. Not all musicians appeared on the radio. So there are a lot of important musicians who never recorded. And so we will never know what they sounded like. We could read about what they sounded like. People remembering, oh, I remember listening to so-and-so play Buddy Bolden, for example, one of the big names at the very beginning of jazz, but he didn't make any records. So we just don't know how he sounded. So records are important and we need to pay attention to them, but we always have to think in the back of our minds, this is a partial, incomplete, standardized even, you know, view or picture of the music of any time period, especially in those early years, the teens, the 20s, the 30s, even the 40s. Of course, you know, in 1929, something happens in this country and all over the world that brings about what is known as the Great Depression, and subsequently, there's going to be a lot fewer records being produced because people didn't have money to buy them. So recording activity slowed down during the Depression, starting in 1929, and for that reason, I don't know if you've heard this expression, the golden age of radio. For that reason, the 30s and the 40s are the golden age of radio, because if you were able to buy a radio set, and sometimes you just shared it with your neighbors, they would all come to your house, especially in the poorer areas, and just everyone would sit around the radio, the way people now sit around, I don't know, I guess a television set or a computer to watch something. Well, people would sit around to listen to stuff, right? And so radio was cheaper than buying records. You know, you had the set, and then you had access to information, you had access to news, you had access to music, to entertainment of all kinds. So, you know, by the mid-1920s, radio had gone from being a medium that only interested a few amateurs who were in the know, to becoming a well-established source of information, news, but most of all, entertainment. in an increasing number of American households. And this happened both in urban and rural areas. There were powerful stations that began to appear in bigger cities. For example, New York, Chicago, Atlanta, LA, Nashville, Memphis. And most of them, think about this, were owned by newspapers, by retail stores, or by insurance companies, because they could use them as a way to advertise their products. For example, there was WSB in Atlanta that was a station owned by a newspaper there. WLS in Chicago, which was owned by WLS, world's largest store, which was Sears and Roebuck, the mail order and retail store. And then there was WSM in Nashville. It still exists to this day, 6:50 a.m. WSM in Nashville was owned by the National Life Insurance Company, and WSM stands for We Shield Millions, because they were an insurance company, right? Now, from the very beginning of commercial broadcasting, the broadcasters realized that music was important for radio. You know, you could have somebody talk, of course, you know, there were religious broadcasts, there were all sorts of different kinds of broadcasts, but music, you know, featured heavily on the airwaves. And this was very important, for instance, in the popularization of country music in the 1920s and the 1930s. I'm sure you have heard of the Grand Ole Opry, right? And you can still go and on a Friday night or a Saturday night to the Grand Ole Opry House or the Riot Auditorium in Nashville and still, you know, attend the actual broadcasts that are, you know, seen as actual concerts that you can attend. But they're also broadcast. Now this started in 1925, so they're approaching their 100th anniversary of the Grand Ole Opry that never, ever in those almost 100 years missed a broadcast on a Saturday night. It's the longest running radio show in the history of the world, not just America. So, and it's still going, fairly strong, not as strong as it used to be in its heyday. But, you know, the Opry was not the only one. The Opry, you know, started as what they called a barn dance, and WSM had its own barn dance, but if you went to Chicago, they had their own on WLS. If you went to Atlanta, same thing. If you went to Wheeling, West Virginia, they had one. If you went to Shreveport, Louisiana, they had their own. So this was just a showcase, powerful showcase for country musicians. And the Opry was the most famous of them all, out of Nashville. It was a family-oriented radio show, and this is important. Anyone could listen to this. There was no profanity. Of course, there was never any profanity on radio back in those days, and even today, there's very little, and it's regulated. But this was a family-oriented radio show. It emphasized traditional values, also a rural image, you know. But the early musicians were usually highly trained, highly educated people. For example, there was a guy called Dr. Humphrey Bate. I think the name of his band was the Possum Hunters, but they were no Possum Hunters. He was a doctor who knew how to play an instrument, and you know they had a group. You have also to think that there were fewer stations at that time, so evening broadcasts in particular covered a large portion of the country. So it was broadcast out of Nashville, but it could be heard in a huge portion of the U.S., not just in Tennessee, or not just in Tennessee and Kentucky, you know. And as the popularity of the Opry grew, you know, so grew the popularity of the performers on the show. People like Uncle Dave Macon, who was a banjo player, D. Ford Bailey, who was African American and was a fantastic harmonica player. They treated him really poorly in my view, but he was a great musician and a rare instance of an African American musician on a country show in the 1920s and 30s. He lived into the 1960s, I believe, and or 70s, and he made a few recordings, but he was really good, very good musician. And later Roy Acuff, who was a huge star, starting in the 30s and 40s. Well, this helped Nashville become established as a recording center. If Nashville is known for music, in huge part, it's because of the Grand Ole Opry. And the Grand Ole Opry made it the center of recording that it now is, and that it has been throughout the second half of the 20th century. something interesting about radio and about records is that, people all over the country were listening more or less to the same kind of music and to different styles of music, right? And so lines between the styles were blurred in the 20s and 30s. Blues and country music were often intertwined. Jazz and country and blues were often intertwined as well. And think about this: the 20s and the 30s were and 40s, and later on too. This was a highly segregated America, very segregated. But it wasn't uncommon for black and white musicians to record together. Now, maybe they definitely couldn't go to the same restaurants together. They couldn't drink from the same fountains, possibly. But they were recording together. For example, Jimmie Rodgers and Louis Armstrong recorded a Blue Yodel. I think it's Blue Yodel number 8 together. Jimmie Rodgers, the biggest country star at the time, and Louis Armstrong, one of the best jazzmen of all time, together in the recording studio. They were both produced by Ralph Peer. That's how that happened. But it's a blues song about Memphis. It says something about Memphis and the corner of Beale and Maine. So it's talking about, the city of Memphis. The Benny Goodman Quartet. Benny Goodman was a jazz swing musician, and his quartet was made out of Jewish, white, and black musicians. We had Teddy Wilson, we had Lionel Hampton. They were African American, and then Benny Goodman, Gene Krupa on the drums. They were white Jewish musicians. And when Benny Goodman appeared at Carnegie Hall in New York City in 1938, the band was mixed. 1938. So the musicians and the artists are usually ahead of their time at things like this. We start talking about civil rights in the 50s, 60s, 70s, but there were people already doing things for civil rights way before the 50s, 60s, and 70s. People like Benny Goodman, for example. And then one thing to tell you about that you might have heard about regarding radio in the 30s is the phenomenon that was known as border radio. What was border radio? You may have heard of border radio. In the 30s, there were some sketchy characters like Norman Baker, who was a quack doctor who claimed that he could cure cancer. Or John Brinkley, another quack who claimed he could cure all kinds of illnesses by this procedure where he transplanted goat testicles into human bodies. Of course, that didn't work, and the cure for cancer didn't work, but these people made a ton of money, and they used the radio for that, to sell their wares. And when they came under scrutiny from the American Medical Association, obviously somebody was going to check on this, and the FCC, what they did is they moved to the U.S.-Mexico border, to places on the other side of the border. They were set up, the transmitters were on the Mexican side of the border, and they were operating from places like Del Rio, Texas, which, it's right there on the southern border. And they started stations like XERA or XERF that instead of the typical 50,000 watts of power, they had stations that operated at 500,000 watts, one of them 1 million watts. So that was heard not just in the United States, but in Europe, in Australia. There were reports from Jamaica that people were listening to these stations. And what did these stations have? Well, they had fortune tellers on the air. They had, peddlers of all sorts of products. There was one person that on one of these stations was selling autographed pictures of Jesus. Now, how he got them autographed and, especially a picture, I don't know. But he was selling this on the radio, believe it or not. Now, this is kind of funny. It's also dangerous because, a lot of people suffered from this. There were people who were not sick, who became sick because of these doctors who said, I'm going to cure an illness that you don't really have, those kinds of things. But one thing that's important from the music standpoint is that, people like Brinkley, like Norman Baker, they were using country music performers in their broadcasts. They were luring people like the Carter family to come down to Mexico and broadcast on their powerful stations. And of course, some of these musicians did it because, think about it, this was like the internet at the time. It could be heard all over the world, not just in the US, not just in Tennessee, all over the world. So some of them did it, the Carter family did it for a while, for example, and people who would later become stars. You probably have heard of Johnny Cash, Waylon Jennings. I'm a rambling man, Well, they were young at the time, in the 30s. They were maybe, 5, 6, 10, and they were listening to these broadcasts. Johnny Cash, by the way, would later marry June Carter, who was a little kid performing on these stations with the Carter family. So they were important from that perspective. There was finally some sort of agreement between the U.S. and the Mexican government to stop these radio stations because they were clearly illegal in many ways, and they were doing things that were dangerous for the listeners and taking in their money, people that didn't have any money, and they would pawn everything they had just to go down to Del Rio, Texas, and get one of these procedures for illnesses that they probably didn't even have, and they were dangerous. Some people died on the operating table because this was a disaster. But it was fixed after a while. But people like John Brinkley, for example, were among the richest people in the United States at that time. They were making tons of money. There are some books, about that phenomenon that I find really, really interesting. And I'll tell you in just a few minutes when I finish my presentation what those books are. And then I don't know if you've heard of what is known as the swing era, the era of the big bands. This starts around 1935, 36. It was, when Elvis came along, and then the Beatles came along, and and they were followed by so many people, and they had so many fans. The band leaders of the swing era were sort of like that too. They were mobbed, and they had to stay away from crowds because they were extremely popular band leaders. People like Benny Goodman, for example, Artie Shaw, Glenn Miller, Tommy Dorsey, Count Basie, Duke Ellington. All those guys had big swing bands, and swing really is a kind of usually up-tempo jazz that is designed for dancing, and that is primarily performed by large orchestras that we know as the big bands. When you hear the word big band, you think of just a huge orchestra playing up-tempo jazz that they called swing. Now, for the popularization of swing, which was the popular music of the time, there was a time in this country where you would turn on the radio and jazz was the popular music of the time under the form of swing, right? Now, this hasn't happened for decades. Jazz is not the popular music right now. It's evolved in different ways, and it's not a kind of popular music anymore. It's almost more of an academic sort of music, seen almost as a kind of American classical music. But at the time, you could turn, in the 30s, 40s, you turn on the radio, most of the times you're going to be listening to a lot of jazz and swing. Now, radio was very important in the popularization of swing because there were what was known as the remote broadcasts. So you had these bands that were traveling all over the country, and they played in hotels, and they played in clubs, and they'd play in ballrooms, the Palomar Ballroom in LA, for example. And from there, they would broadcast their concerts live at night. And people could not go to LA to the Palomar, but they could listen to the music on the radio and maybe even dance to it at home. So these remote broadcasts were very popular, and this boosted concert attendance for the bands, record sales as well. It gave exposure to the bands, and was very cheap to produce by the radio stations because all they had to do was just bring in some broadcasting equipment and a few microphones and an announcer, and that was it, right? So it's important because it helped boost the sales and the popularity of the music and the bands, but also because a lot of these live appearances from these bands in the remote broadcasts were recorded off the air. as air checks. And that way we have live performances by some of the best jazz musicians, black and white, of the era, thanks to these remote broadcasts that were recorded off the air. That's what's called an air check. And you can find a lot of them, for example, on the Internet Archive, archive.org, online. You put in big band remote broadcasts, and a bunch of them come out, and you can hear these bands, Duke Ellington, Benny Goodman, anybody, Count Basie, performing live. And that's what people were listening to. I want to finish, by saying that unfortunately, the swing era died down or slipped away, diffused itself after World War II for many reasons. One of the reasons was the baby boom after World War II. People were they were having more kids. They needed to stay home more. They couldn't go out as often. Television began to appear in American households in the mid to late 40s, and so people just stayed home and watched TV shows, which were basically versions of radio shows with image. That's what early TV shows were like. All of them were broadcast live, by the way, because they couldn't record TV shows in those days yet. That was another reason why the big bands didn't survive. Then there was also a well-known strike of the American Federation of Musicians in the 40s that lingered for several years, and that didn't help. Now, singers were not considered musicians in those days by the AFM, and that's one of the reasons why after World War II, the singers, Frank Sinatra, for example, you probably heard of Sinatra, but Perry Como, Dick Haymes, Joe Stafford, the singers in the band that were usually added attractions because they were not considered musicians, they could record, whereas the musicians could not record. So that didn't help the big band leaders or the musicians, that they could not record for such a long time. Anyway, one of the most interesting things is something that I read in a book by Gene Lees. Gene Lees was a songwriter, and he adapted a lot of Brazilian songs into English, like The Girl from Ipanema, for example, or Quiet Nights with Quiet Stars. Well, he wrote a book in which he says that one of the reasons why the big band era ended, besides all of these that I'm telling you, is that after World War II, the United States government began to dismantle the railway system in this country in favor of the automobile industry. And therefore, it became much more difficult and much more expensive for band leaders to keep their bands on the road, because it was easy to just book them tickets on a train and go that way from city to city. These big bands had 20, 30 musicians plus their equipment and stuff, and sometimes they were doing one-nighters. They would go to a city, play one night, and then go to another, play the next night. Without the railway system, it wasn't as easy, it wasn't as affordable to do it, and I had never thought of that. But it definitely is one of the reasons, in my view, why the big bands sort of faded away. But they didn't go away because a lot of them stayed in Hollywood. They began appearing on television late night shows, for example. You know that all of these late night shows, Jimmy Fallon and what are those guys? Jimmy Kimmel and Conan O'Brien, they always have live music. That is a trend that began in the 50s and in the 60s when these shows, late night talk shows, began. And some of the best musicians at the time, especially in the big band business, they just stayed with these studio bands that would play for the movies, that would play on television, and this has stayed this way up until the present day, and that's why all those shows still have live music, which I appreciate, because usually some of the things that they talk about I'm not really that interested in, but the music is usually very good, right? So that's basically all I wanted to tell you about. That the radio has always been my favorite medium. I watch TV like everybody else, and I go to the movies and stuff, but my favorite thing to do, especially when I'm in the car or something, is to listen to the radio. And I myself, for many years, starting when I was 17 and I was still living in Europe, and then later in Nashville as well, when I was at Vanderbilt University earning my PhD in Spanish in Nashville. I hosted music radio shows. And what I was always trying to do in the radio shows that I have hosted, both in Europe and in here in the US, there's two things that I was always interested in. First of all, letting the music do the talking. It was important for me to play a lot of music on those shows. I would give some information about the recordings and stuff, but I mostly wanted to play the records. I would say, who the soloist was, where it was recorded, the year, who was singing, that kind of thing. But the music was the important thing. Showcase the music on any music show, right? And then another thing was, I'm talking about Nashville in the mid-2000s, so there were still quite a few older, especially country music stars from the 50s, 60s, 70s who were still alive, but they hadn't gotten a lot of recognition in those last years of their lives, and they didn't appear on the radio very much. So I would call them up, try to get in touch with them, and bring them to the station for an interview. And some of my nicest memories of the 6 years I lived in Nashville while I was at Vanderbilt earning my PhD have to do not with the classes, not with going out with my friends and drinking, although that was also, there are also some nice memories about that, but having the chance to talk to these musicians and to talk about their careers and to tell them, listen, I appreciate your music. What you've done is important to me, and I think it is also for a lot of people listening. Vanderbilt at that time had a radio station, WRVU, which they later sold. It doesn't exist anymore. But that's one of the things that I was doing. And I can clearly remember that in the 1960s, 50s, 60s, 70s, there was a country singer from Texas. They called him the Tall Texan, and his name was Billy Walker. And he had a few hits, Cross the Brasses at Waco, Circumstances, Charlie's Shoes. Those were big hit records in country music in those days. Well, this man was still alive. And I call his office, and he answers the phone, and he comes to the station for an interview. And we were talking about his career and, playing some of his records and reminiscing about his life in country music and the people that he'd known and stuff like that. And then I say, well, now we're going to listen to one of your songs. And this song is called Honky Tonkitis. Honky Tonkitis is almost like an illness of being in the honky tonk drinking, right? And he looks at me and he says, I didn't record that song. That was not me. That was Carl Butler. And I said, well, yeah, Carl Butler had the hit on it, but I have a record here with your name on it that says you recorded this song. And he said, no, I never recorded that song. I said, well, let's play the song and see. 4 or 5 bars into the song, he was like, I actually did record that song. He had forgotten. He'd done it at the tail end of a recording session. He just could not remember that he had done it. And he said very clearly to me, I never thought when I was making these records that anybody, 60 years on, 40 years on, would be listening to these records. We were making these records just to make ends meet. It was our profession. We were trying to make some money. So that all goes back to the idea of these companies in the 1920s finding a new market for blues music, for country music, for jazz, for different types of music that they had overlooked until then. And the money talks usually, right? And thanks to that, we do have access to some great music that would have been lost. And unfortunately, a lot of it was lost because a lot of it was, just went unrecorded. So to finish, I'll just give you a couple of bibliographical references. For example, if you want to know about border radio, John Brinkley and Norman Baker and all those guys that were quacks who were trying to do whatever they could to sell stuff over the radio in those 500,000 watt, million watt powered stations. This is a good book by Gene Fowler and Bill Crawford called Border Radio, and it tells you the story of these radio people and their stations starting in the 1930s. if you want to learn about the beginnings of the Grand Ole Opry, you have this book here, which is called The Good-Natured Riot, The Birth of the Grand Ole Opry, by one of the best writers in country music that has ever lived. He's passed away, unfortunately. His name is Charles K. Wolfe. And this tells you how the Grand Ole Opry, which is still quite popular in Nashville and known all over the world, how it started in 1925 and how it evolved in the 30s and 40s. Really good book. And then finally, if you're interested in that idea of how the dismantling of the railway system affected the big bands, the jazz and swing big bands of the 40s, this is the book by Gin Lees that I was telling you about. And there's a chapter here called Pavilion in the Rain. Pavilion in the Rain is a song by Johnny Mercer, who was a singer and songwriter, jazz singer and songwriter, very popular in the 30s, 40s, 50s. And he talks about that, how the big bands ended and some of the reasons why. That music that was so exciting and so popular and so avant-garde in many ways just sort of disappeared in this country. You're always going to find, especially living in a place as musically charged as Jackson, Tennessee, because there's a lot of music history in Jackson and around this area, Memphis, Nashville, all over the place. You're always going to find surprises, people that you had no idea lived around here, but who were great musicians, sometimes forgotten. An example is this man here, Sam the Man Taylor, right here. This saxophonist, he had a wonderful sound, Sam the Man Taylor. And he played with Cab Calloway, which was, who was one of the biggest band leaders of the 30s, 40s, and was in movies, was in radio. They called him the Heidi Ho Man, Cab Calloway, because he had that song, Heidi, Heidi, Heidi Ho, yeah, it's just a huge hit. Well, Sam the Man Taylor played honking saxophone on those records, and he was from Lexington, Tennessee. So just 20 miles down the road. And, I once wrote an article about him and the Lexington Progress a few weeks ago reprinted it in one of their issues. But that's him, Sam the Man Taylor, from just, from exit 108 on I-40. I don't know if you have any questions or anything, but I'll be happy to stop now and let you ask any questions you might have.
What really sparked your interest in? I know you guys grew up in the era where radio was like the big thing to listen to, but really, what made you really want to dig in for yourself and learn more about it, like other than your father having a lot of?
I think primarily my father, because he is a huge collector, not just of music, but also of literature. He has thousands of books at home, and I was always surrounded by this stuff. And I am naturally interested in the beginnings of things and how sound became recorded, how radio started. And so, I would say that the example from my father, together with, a natural interest that I have in history of music and in the beginning of certain technological things like this, is what really sparked my interest. And then, having the chance to do radio myself was important as well, because I realized not only how exciting it really is to do a radio show, but also how much it helps you when you're going to become a teacher. I remember some of my professors at Vanderbilt used to say, "You're wasting your time with that radio show. You shouldn't be doing that, Just concentrate on your PhD." But they could not see that when you're talking on the radio, you're really speaking in public, just like you are speaking in public when you're teaching. Now, the audience is not right there in front of you, but hopefully they are somewhere listening to you. So that's what I would say. And then also, radio, like television, has evolved a lot from, its inception in the 20s up until what it is now. But if you want to listen to what radio sounded like in the 1930s, there was a station called WJSV in Washington, D.C. And in 1939, they recorded off the air their entire broadcasting schedule. And that included, radio drama in the morning, newscasts, a special message from Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1939. That was, around the beginning of World War II. And it also included a baseball game, I think the Washington Nationals game. And then at night, once it hits 10, 11 p.m., it's these remote broadcasts of big bands, of music from some ballroom or some club somewhere. And of course, it's jazz, it's swing. So it's very interesting. Sometimes I go to, it's on the Internet Archive, archive.org, and you write complete broadcast day 1939, and there you have the recordings. It's like 19 hours of like a whole broadcast day, because of course radio signed off the air when it was like 1 or 2 a.m. They didn't broadcast 24/7. They broadcast maybe 18, 19 hours every day. And it's very interesting because it's almost like going back in time and listening to what people would be listening to on a daily basis. Just like now people watch TV or they're on their phones. That's what people did in those days. And it's interesting to hear how the voices of the people are different. The people speaking on the radio have different intonation, different voices. And I think that's always been fascinating to me. So that's what I would say.
Tom, thank you so much for taking time to come speak with us today. I know students enjoy it. I enjoy it every time, and learn something every time you talk. It's fantastic. I really appreciate you.
Well, I appreciate it, and yeah, I'll be happy to do it anytime you need me. It's a topic that I've always been interested in, and even though I can't play an instrument, I'm really invested and interested in learning more about records and different styles and music history. So I appreciate you listening to me today. Thank you.